over 4 decades, Joseph DeAngelo committed a horrifying string of crimes across California. More than 100 burglaries, over 50 rapes, and at least 13 brutal murders while evading capture in one of the largest and longest-running manhunts in American history. This is a case of terror, heartbreak, and ultimately triumph over one of the most elusive criminals in American history, the Golden State Killer. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York. DeAngelo's upbringing was reportedly troubled. He served in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War, then returned to study criminal justice at California State University, Sacramento. In May 1970, DeAngelo was engaged to nursing student Bonnie Jean Colwell. However, she ended the relationship in 1971 after he became abusive. Following the breakup, DeAngelo attempted to force Colwell to marry him by threatening her with a gun and demanding they elope to Reno. After college, he worked briefly as a police officer in Exeter, California, and later in Auburn. It was during his tenure as a police officer that he began to commit crimes that would ultimately become the subject of intense police investigations for decades. In 1973, DeAngelo married Sharon Marie Huddle, and they would have 3 daughters together. His eldest daughter later described him as a perfect father, and his family had no idea of the double life he was living. DeAngelo's crime spree began in 1974 with a series of burglaries and escalated to violent sexual assaults and murder. His crimes can be divided into 3 distinct phases, during which he terrorized various regions of California under different aliases. From 1974 to 1975, DeAngelo was known as the Visalia Ransacker. His crimes in Visalia involved more than 100 burglaries, in which he would break into homes, steal items of little value, and sometimes rearrange belongings, leaving residents feeling violated and fearful. In 1975, DeAngelo escalated his behavior by attempting to kidnap a 16-year-old girl. When confronted by her father, Claude Snelling, DeAngelo shot and killed him, marking his first known murder. After leaving Visalia, DeAngelo re-emerged in Sacramento as the East Area Rapist, responsible for a series of violent sexual assaults that began in 1976. His attacks were methodical. He would break into homes late at night, often tie up his victims, and instill fear with threats and taunts. He targeted women and couples, and his crimes showed a chilling degree of planning and sadism. By 1979, DeAngelo had committed more than 50 rapes, each one escalating in brutality and audacity. DeAngelo later moved to Southern California, where he became known as the original Night Stalker. Between 1979 and 1986, he committed a series of murders, targeting couples and leaving behind scenes of profound violence. His crimes often involved sexual assault and torture before the murders, with his victims typically bludgeoned or shot to death. The first murders attributed to the original Night Stalker occurred on December 30th, 1979. DeAngelo broke into the home of orthopedic surgeon Dr. Robert Offerman. There, he tied up Offerman and raped 35-year-old clinical psychologist Dr. Deborah Alexandria Manning before shooting both victims. After committing the murders, DeAngelo casually ate leftover Christmas turkey from Offerman's refrigerator. The Night Stalker would strike again at least 5 times, claiming another 8 lives. On March 13, 1980, he murdered Charlene and Linman Smith. On August 19, 1980, he killed Keith and Patricia Harrington. On February 6, 1981, he murdered Manuela Witham. And on June 27, 1981, he killed Cherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez. After a 5-year dormancy, DeAngelo struck again in 1986. Janelle Lisa Cruz became the final known victim of the Night Stalker. Cruz was only 18 years old when she was brutally murdered on May 4, 1986. Her parents were out of town, leaving Janelle alone in the house. DeAngelo broke into her home, sexually assaulted her, and then murdered her. She was beaten beyond recognition with a pipe wrench. For decades, law enforcement was unable to identify the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, or the original Night Stalker, and the cases went cold. It wasn't until years later, in 2001, that DNA testing linked all these crimes to one individual, prompting the moniker the Golden State Killer, though the identity of the perpetrator still remained a mystery. In 2018, authorities took advantage of emerging genetic genealogy techniques. Investigators uploaded a sample of the killer's DNA to an open-source genealogical database, using it to identify relatives of the suspect. This ultimately led them to DeAngelo, who was living quietly in Citrus Heights. In order to obtain DeAngelo's DNA, investigators followed him to a Hobby Lobby in Roseville and swabbed the door handle of his car while he shopped in the store. The sample contained DNA from 3 people, and one of the profiles matched the Golden State Killer. On April 23, 2018, investigators collected an additional DNA sample from DeAngelo. They placed him under surveillance and waited for him to take out his trash. Several discarded items were then collected and sent to the lab for DNA analysis. The results confirmed that Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was in fact the Golden State Killer. On April 28, 2018, DeAngelo, by then 72 years old, was arrested, ending a decades-long search for one of the most notorious criminals in Californian history. Following his arrest, DeAngelo was charged with 13 counts of murder. He could not be charged for the rapes or burglaries committed as the Visalia ransacker and the East Area rapist, as the statute of limitations had expired for those offenses. Initially, he pleaded not guilty, but in June 2020, he struck a plea deal, admitting guilt in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole, thereby avoiding the death penalty. During the sentencing hearing in August 2020, victims and their families confronted DeAngelo, describing the lasting impact of his crimes.
Probably one of our most fundamental and primal fears is a boogeyman who attacks people in the middle of the night while they are asleep. That is what you did to me. I encountered pure evil when you awakened me. You thrust me into a nightmare of fear and violence.
DeAngelo's own statement was brief and void of genuine remorse, leaving a haunting reminder of his callous nature. He was sentenced to multiple life terms without parole, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. His case is one of the first high-profile criminal cases solved using genetic genealogy, an investigative technique that has since been used to solve numerous cold cases worldwide. The breakthrough spurred debate over privacy concerns, as well as the ethical use of genetic data for law enforcement purposes. The convictions of Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. closed a dark chapter, bringing long-sought answers to the families and communities left shattered by the Golden State Killer.